We are back, and you're listening to the Critical Hour on Radio Sputnik. I'm Wilmer Leon, joined here by my co-host, Garland Nixon.
Thank you, Wilmer.
Sputnik International reports, I'm telling you, he did it. Seymour Hersh slams Biden as Nord Stream bomber at National Press Club. Pulitzer Prize-winning investigative journalist Seymour Hersh made waves again Tuesday night when he excoriated the Biden administration and lambasted mainstream media coverage of the Nord Stream bombing, the Russiagate story, and the Democratic Party's love of war at the National Press Club in Washington, D.C. For insight into this, we turn to our next guest. He holds the John J. and Rebecca Morris Chair of History and African American Studies at the University of Houston. He's one of the most prolific writers of our time. His latest book is entitled The Counter-Revolution of 1836, Texas Slavery, Jim Crow, and the Roots of American Fascism. Dr. Gerald Horne, as always, welcome back.
Thank you for inviting me.
We've got to cut. We've got these lunatics, Hersh told audiences at the Storied Press Center. While he said he's sure they're high IQ, the journalist noted that Blinken and Sullivan and Newland are just doing insane things. Two things. One, Dr. Horne, your thoughts of Cy Hersh's assessment, and two, the fact that this wasn't front page, first story, CNN and MSNBC CIA.
Well, if anything, Seymour Hersh, the Pulitzer Prize-winning 85-year-old investigative journalist, is understating the gravity of what's at play. If you only track the visits to Washington of Chancellor Schultz in Berlin, you'll get an idea of what I'm talking about. Just a few days ago, he skulked into town, that is to say, into Washington, left without holding a press conference. Apparently, he did not want to talk on the telephone. Perhaps the knives are out in Berlin because it's well known that he does not get along with his foreign minister, Madame Baerbock, his other cabinet member, Mr. Habeck, and the depth of the antagonism amongst the leaders in Berlin is reaching Shakespearean proportion. And I think it has a lot to do with the fact that Mr. Schultz probably is all too aware of the fact that Mr. Seymour Hersh has uncovered, which is that an act of war, an act of aggression was carried out against his country by an erstwhile ally, speaking of the United States of America, which has a military base on German soil, speaking of Ramstein, which in some ways challenges the very sovereignty of the locomotive of the European Union. And if you go back a year or so ago, before the special military operation of Moscow in Ukraine, you'll recall another meeting in Washington with Mr. Schultz standing alongside the U.S. President, Mr. Biden. And Mr. Biden was asked whether he could do something about this Nord Stream 2 pipeline, which Seymour Hersh now charges the United States had something to do with blowing up. And Mr. Biden all but admitted that the United States planned to execute the action that Seymour Hersh is now charging him with. And so if you look at these two visits to Washington of Chancellor Schultz, it does not present a very charming or pretty picture or portrait of Germany. And it's understandable now why the knives are out, why Mr. Schultz is rather leery of his fellow cabinet members, why the European press is having a field day in reporting on various aspects of this crime that Washington perpetrated. And once again, the U.S. press, that is to say the corporate media, is left with egg on its face because of its reluctance to cover the details. Now, of course, we know about that front page story in the New York Times a few days ago that suggested that it was all a Ukraine operation that took place in terms of the blowing up of this pipeline. That barely passes the giggle test. So we know that the Ukrainian authorities barely go to the bathroom without asking permission from their paymasters in Washington. And in any case, there was a very wonderful cartoon that appeared that showed a cloak over a shrouded figure. The cloak reads Ukraine. You snatch the cloak away, and underneath you see USA. And that, it seems to me, sums up the state of play as we speak.
We're looking at what is going on in the United States empire and the U.S. empire. And it seems to me that they have just swallowed a poison pill in Ukraine. They got what they wanted. They pushed for this thing, and they armed Ukraine to the teeth, and then they provoked Russia, and eventually they got the invasion. And now it seems to me that their entire empire is dissolving. Germany at one point was the economic engine of Europe. It was the powerhouse. The banks there were making all the money off of the EU, and now Germany is the laughing stock of the world. Their leadership is in disarray. And need we even mention what's going on with the banks, Dr. Horne?
Well, I think you summed it up rather nicely. Of course, we also should mention that the European Union is up in arms about the so-called Inflation Reduction Act, which, amongst other things, it was passed in Congress, signed into law by Mr. Biden, and it provides an array of green subsidies that will have the impact of attracting European industry across the Atlantic to North America, further weakening and wounding the European Union. Recall that it was John Bolton, the former national security advisor under Mr. Trump, who said that Mr. Trump saw the European Union as one of the major antagonists of U.S. imperialism, and the Inflation Reduction Act, in fact, helps to exacerbate that tension between the two giants. And I should also mention that France is also up in arms about the Inflation Reduction Act. They have reason to be concerned. We recall how the United States went behind Paris's back and basically stabbed Mr. Macron in the back by attracting Australia to this so-called AUKUS pact, United States, Australia, UK, and deprived French industry of a submarine building bonanza that it could have enjoyed. And that brings us to the following point, which is that Mr. Macron will be making a path-breaking visit to China within a few days or weeks, indicating that he is walking in the footsteps of Chancellor Scholz, who a few weeks ago made his own path-breaking visit to China with a plane load of German businessmen in tow. And that brings us, of course, to the split in the U.S. ruling class over this question of Ukraine. You know about Governor DeSantis of Florida, who has joined Mr. Trump, the other challenger for the Republican nomination for president, in throwing cold water on this whole Ukrainian empire. Their idea is that China is the big enchilada and that the focus should be on China. But the problem there is that if you put the focus on China, you further split the North Atlantic Alliance because, as noted, Berlin and Paris are not on board. And in fact, even the lapdog in London is not on board. Keep in mind that an official from Hong Kong, the special administrative region of the People's Republic of China, as we speak, is winging his way into London. You can expect an entente between London and Beijing, further weakening this new Cold War with China. And the cherry on top of the cake is that within days, President Xi Jinping of China is due in Moscow. And the camera flash bulbs will be popping because this could be the beginning of an entirely new international correlation of forces, which will have U.S. imperialism crying in its beer.
And that takes me to my next question. As you were talking about Macron going to Beijing in the shadow of Scholz, well, Macron goes to Beijing now as China is championing the successful negotiation between the Saudis and the Iranians. So the whole, as somebody said yesterday, China has disrupted the chessboard and taken the board off the table. So with that latest development in terms of what's been going on behind the scenes and the fact that the United States had no clue that this agreement was in the works, to me, that makes the trip of Macron to Beijing that much more significant. Your thoughts, sir?
Well, certainly we need to seriously contemplate not only cutting the military budget, which, after all, the Pentagon has failed spectacularly in Afghanistan in Iraq, in Libya, places too numerous to mention, but also the intelligence budget. What's the use of spending billions of dollars on an intelligence budget when you are shocked and surprised by this pact China negotiates between Iran and Saudi Arabia, which will have earthquake-like tremors throughout the region and throughout the world? You already saw and you already have seen that a number of Arab leaders who are waging a war hot and cold against Moscow's ally in Damascus, Syria, in light of the fact that this pact with Iran and Saudi Arabia has been negotiated, and with Syria being close to Iran, they've begun to make overtures to Mr. al-Assad, the leader in Damascus, who, by the way, was in Moscow within the last 24 hours. You can also expect the United Arab Emirates, more specifically, more particularly, you can expect Dubai, which right now is hosting a horde of Russians, which the New York Times has reported on. And that further is puncturing this ability to put a cap on oil prices so as to wound the coffers of Moscow. Saudi Arabia has broken ranks with regard to that cap, and you can expect other nations to do so as well. And so once again, one has to wonder what is the point of spending billions and billions and billions on the Pentagon and on intelligence when obviously these folks are incapable of maintaining the hegemony of the U.S. empire, which is in the process of unraveling as we speak.
Dr. Gerald Horne, as always, thank you so much for your time. We greatly, greatly appreciate that analysis, and we look forward to having you back.
Thank you.
Folks, you're listening